I've been reading some of Raymond Carver's short stories again recently, in particular his collection Elephant, and it reminded me of something I learned from him a while ago that I think's made my writing better. Simply put, there are these short, simple inserts into his writing that really make the worlds of his stories feel more alive. They're just sentences and images here and there that make everything feel more real. So if you're looking for something like that in your own writing, this might be a way to do it. I'm going to talk about how. Let's get started. I could take all day trying to describe to you what this technique exactly is, so to spare you from that, I'll give you an example instead. This is from Carver's story, Whoever Was Using This Bed. And to give you some context, the story centres around a couple talking about a phone call they just received in the middle of the night. It's a very interior, indoors feeling kind of story. Until Carver opens it up and gives it a bit of context in relation to the rest of the world and gives it a place in time and space with these couple of lines. I get up again and go to the window and raise it a few inches. I can feel the cool air that comes in, and from a distance I hear a truck gearing down as it starts up the grade that will take it to the pass and on over into the next state. What I love about that passage is how it introduces distance to a story that otherwise just takes place in one or two rooms in one or two houses. It just gives it this space. Those few lines, for me, place it in a town that I now know has a highway that leads all the way to the next state. That creates that zoom out effect that I sometimes talk about in videos, and it gives me the idea that this house, where the story is taking place, is just one house, on one street, on one town, and so on. And the story could of course function perfectly well without this. Nothing would be lost from a narrative perspective if this little diversion didn't exist. This isn't the kind of addition to your writing that is absolutely essential. It's a stylistic choice, and it's one that I like to see whenever I read, and I try to use myself, and I think it's worth writers looking into. I'll give you another example before I talk a bit more about the benefits of this kind of context-giving passage. This one's from another story called Intimacy, and it's a similar kind of story in many ways. All of the stories in Elephant are of a certain type. However, this time it's not so much scale and that zoom out effect that Carver uses to make his world feel alive. In this one, he uses one of those context-giving passages to add significance to a conversation, to mark it in time and just give it a bit more weight. Two characters have a conversation in one of their houses, and afterwards, here's how he adds that context. She walks me to the front door, which has been standing open all this while. The door that was letting in light and fresh air this morning and sounds off the street, all of which we had ignored. This one, I think, makes the setting feel full of life. There's sounds from the street outside and there's light and air coming in. All of these small details make that world feel more established and real. It gives the effect that this story just happens to be taking place in this pre-existing world, as opposed to giving the effect that the world exists purely for a place to tell this story. That's a trap that I've fallen into with my own writing, especially when it comes to my old novels. Nothing felt real, nothing felt substantial, because I was creating too narrow a viewpoint. I was just building the world of my story underneath each narrative event, which is why it felt so insubstantial. Obviously, the world of your story does revolve around your main characters. It does exist as a container in which to tell the story. There's no getting away from that, and it's always the case. But when that fact is too prominent and it becomes noticeable for a reader, it draws a lot of attention to the fact that you made your entire story up. I love analogies, so imagine you're watching a play, maybe you've had this happen to you in real life before. You find yourself zoning out a little bit, you look at the lighting rig above the stage, maybe there's a crease in the curtains or an emergency exit sign off to one side, and suddenly you become aware of just how artificial everything seems. It doesn't feel real anymore, and you're too aware that what you're watching on stage is just fiction. Then, because of that, the characters look like actors, and the set just looks like painted plasterboard, so there goes your immersion, probably your enjoyment as well. The same thing can happen with stories and novels as well, I think. The reader can stop seeing your world and start seeing just printed words or the edges of pages. That's why I love this technique of reinforcing that world around your characters and making sure it feels alive. It fills in that background space so that the reader never sees the lighting rig or the crease in the curtains. All they can see is stage. But that's just one of the benefits of adding in lines like this. Another is it's a great opportunity to get in some value-adding description. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you might have heard me say that I don't like description for the sake of description. To me, the author thinking up a really nice way to describe something isn't always reason enough to add it into the story. But if you're using description to bring life to the environment of your story, like in those previous examples, then I think it's a great time to use some nice description. I try to do this myself sometimes. In my current work in progress, I had a scene where I wanted to describe two characters driving down a desert road in the middle of the night. So I tried to employ that zoom out, context giving technique, and this is what I came up with. Wiley thinks about how they'd look from a plane, from space, a spark on a fuse wire in the darkness. It gave me a way of physically describing the scene without saying, they drove along the road in the darkness in the desert. It gave me that bird's eye view of the characters, which made them feel smaller, and that made the environment around them seem much larger. That effect, to me, added weight to the story. If I described all of that from just a simple character's perspective, it wouldn't have had those qualities, and I feel like it would have just felt too narrow. In fact, the narrative is so simple here, a car driving through the desert at night, that it's almost boring. It's really simple. There's not much to really say about it, which is exactly the kind of reason a reader might start to zone out a little bit and start seeing written words and pages instead of story. It was one of those times where I was writing out of utility. You know, those times where those characters have to drive along that road to make the story make sense. It has to happen. There's no way around it. You need to put it into your story. Moments like that, I think, are when we writers are most at risk of readers spotting us and seeing us moving all those puppet strings. So zooming out and giving, again, that context of time and space distracts them from that. It keeps them immersed, it's a nice way of adding some description in, and it stops your story feeling like a simple sequence of narrative event after narrative event. We've all read and written stories like that, I'm sure. They went out, they walked along the road, they went to the shop, they opened the door, they walked in, they talked to the man, they went out. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. Those stories feel really on rails and really directed. And that's what we're trying to avoid. And the great thing is, this technique, those diversions, don't have to be in any way grandiose or profound. They can be the simplest things. I still remember the first time I read something like this and really noticed it. It was in a short story, either by Joyce Carol Oates, or Raymond Carver, or John Cheever. I can't remember which because it was a decade ago. I searched high and low for that story this week and I just couldn't find it. But essentially, the character I remember was just walking through a residential area, and then it said this. In a house across the street, someone turned on a light for a moment, then turned it off again. And when I read that, I remember that it gave me pause. I thought, well, who's that? Why are they turning a light on and off? Are they just looking into a room for a moment? What's going on? It expanded the story for me. It made me feel like there were other people alive and moving around in the world of the story. Was it a profound piece of description or a unique insight that's never been seen before? No, but the story was much better off for it. It made the story feel alive, so it stuck with me and I took that away, and now I use it in my own writing fairly often. Here's an example from my novella in Flash, Gold Fury. Oliver listened to the crackle on the line, the distance. Years ago he used to think it was birds on the wire, somewhere out in the dark. I seem to be a little bit preoccupied with darkness, I've just noticed. But still, it's just a way to suggest that other things are happening in your world, outside of the direct viewpoint and experience of your characters. The aim's to convince the reader that were it possible for them to leave Oliver in that room and walk out to the street outside, that the world would exist and it would feel inhabited and active. That's the goal. And of course, less is more. My suggestion would be to use this technique when your story feels a little bit too straightforward, too easy, a little bit on rails. If you find you're moving from narrative event to narrative event a bit too quickly and a bit too simply, then zoom out a little bit. Make something move in the background and try and convince your reader that something or someone might be there. As always, thank you so much for watching. Click the thumbs up if this was useful, and happy writing.